At this point in the series, we've covered an enormous range of fallacious talking points that creationists employ, from cosmology all the way to molecular biology. Let's finish things up by reviewing arguments that creationists put forward, which are not necessarily based in discrediting scientific data, but are rather more philosophical or theological in nature. It turns out that creationists are not just allergic to science, but also to basic logic, and this shines through in its purest form when the arguments are intended to be of a more basal nature than scientific inquiry. We can also take this opportunity to point out the most popular dishonest tactics that creationists use in discussion or debate, and then throw in any miscellaneous points that didn't fit anywhere else in the series. Let's start out with the existence of the universe, which we alluded to in part 1, but left for later. All creationists, top to bottom, insist that the existence of the universe is totally nonsensical without a deity to have created it. They are perplexed as to how something could exist without cause, yet they do not apply this logic to their deity, which also needs its existence explained, thus inevitably resulting in an infinite regression of deities. They are perplexed as to how a universe could exist without cause, so they invent an infinitely more complex deity that somehow exists without cause. If they are comfortable with their deity simply existing, why can't the universe simply exist? There is no consistency to their logic. The more intellectual creationist will attempt to identify some logical loophole to justify this privileged status for their deity. The universe began to exist, so it needs a cause. But their deity did not begin to exist. He simply has always existed, or exists outside of time, so no cause is required. These justifications, existing infinitely into the past, or existence without time, are precisely as absurd as a universe existing without cause. There is no basis for presuming that such things are possible, and even if we were to entertain the notion of a deity existing, it would not be their specific deity, which can be disproved in countless other ways that go beyond the scope of this series. We can all admit that existence is a mystery. The idea of a universe simply existing is perplexing, and thinking about that idea is discomforting. Logical people experience precisely the same discomfort when imagining a deity existing without cause. There is no inherent difference. Creationists perceive a difference because they want their deity to exist for emotional reasons, either because they were told the deity exists since birth and changing their fundamental worldview would be devastating to their psyche, or because they are afraid to die and they have convinced themselves that their deity will save them from their mortality. These are the two reasons people will insist that a deity must exist. For the rest of us, we certainly cannot disprove the existence of a deity, but the notion that a deity must exist, or that logic somehow points to the existence of a deity, is ridiculous. In the realm of pure philosophy, great thinkers like Leibniz, Wittgenstein, Hume, and Heidegger have pondered the problem of existence. It is puzzling that anything exists rather than nothing. Hume, in particular, argued that although our experience is dominated by causality, perhaps the formation of the universe is fundamentally outside of our experience and may be exempt from this guideline. Perhaps there is an uncaused cause. This could be a deity, or it could be the universe itself. There is no basis for determining such a thing. But if we are comparing the likelihood of a finite thing or an infinite thing existing without cause, the former seems more likely. Some attempts at justifying this notion will talk about nothingness as an unstable state, such that it is, in a way, impossible for nothing to exist. This is about as speculative as metaphysics can get, so this is not an attempt at disproving God, simply at pointing out that logic definitely does not specifically point to the existence of any God. Because science does not understand how the universe began, when creationists insist that it must have been God, this is called a God of the gaps argument. I don't know, therefore God is the essence of this argument. Creationists use this for many things without basis, since they pretend that there are not naturalistic explanations for the formation of the earth as well as the origin and diversity of life. There are. Those are instances where they are shoving their God into a gap that does not exist. The origin of the universe is the only gap where a God still fits, which is why deistic evolution is not specifically unscientific. But in general, I don't know, therefore God is always the worst answer to any scientific question. Various gods have been kicked out of their respective gaps countless times in human history as we began to learn how everything actually works, so one can simply extrapolate that trend. Furthermore, empiricism will always beat baseless guesses that make one feel special. It is a good idea for humanity to simply get comfortable with not knowing things. Pivoting to philosophy of science, or at least misuse of scientific terminology, many creationists will abuse the word theory. Preachers, in particular, will exclaim that evolution is a theory, not a law or a fact. Therefore, it's never been proven. This is preposterous. Gravity, for example, factually exists. It can be described by laws, such as Newton's law of universal gravitation, or theories, such as Einstein's general relativity. Gravity is a natural phenomenon which factually exists and can be described by laws or theories. Furthermore, theories are more powerful than laws. Newton's equation is simply a summary of observations. It has predictive power, but no explanatory power. Relativity has both. It predicts everything Newton's equation does and much more, but also explains what gravity is, the influence of the curvature of spacetime. In science, theories are better than laws. We can say the same about evolution. Evolution factually happens. We observe evolution every single day. We observe how genetic information changes over time, how the distribution of alleles changes over time. We observe speciation events. We observe evolution. Evolution happens. There is no arguing this. What creationists mean, of course, is that it isn't proven that all life evolved from a common ancestor over several billion years. That's where evolutionary theory comes in. Just as gravity is a natural phenomenon that can be described by a theory, evolution is also a natural phenomenon that can be described by a theory. Evolutionary theory explains how evolution occurs. It used to be limited to natural selection in Darwin's time. This was broadened and labeled neo-Darwinism in the early 20th century, and by the end of the 20th century, it came to be known as the modern synthesis. That is our current theory of evolution, one which is still growing today as new mechanisms are discovered. It is not a guess. Theories are not guesses or opinions. Theories are models that correlate large amounts of disparate data, elegantly explain all of this data at once, and make concrete, quantifiable, falsifiable predictions. That's what our evolutionary model does. It takes the diversity of life, the fossil record, genetics, and so many other aspects of biology and explains them with a single model. This model makes predictions, like the genetic similarity we should expect based on phylogenetic relatedness, or the locations of certain fossils based on biogeography, and so much more. Evolution as a theory which explains the diversity of life is consistent beyond reasonable doubt, just like the theory of relativity. Creationism does not do any of this. Creationism is blind faith, coupled with a willful ignorance of scientific principles which contradict that blind faith. Creationists are constantly enacting defense mechanisms to deny this obvious fact. We can see these defense mechanisms in action with other terminology that they themselves have created. First, they will refer to anyone who accepts evolutionary biology as an evolutionist, which is not a real word. This is done to liken science to a belief system that people can subscribe to, just like a religion. Of course, after everything we have discussed in this series, any rational person can see that empirical science is antithetical to faith. Faith is a suspension of reason in favor of emotion. Empiricism is a suspension of emotion in favor of reason. Only the evidence matters. They will do this with Darwin as well. As we mentioned before, they will complain about Darwinism and Darwinists. This serves to denigrate Charles Darwin and paint him as not a scientist but a prophet. Again, this is because they are trying to level the playing field. Science is undeniably superior to religion in determining how the world works and what has physically happened in the past. So dragging an entire field of science down and likening it to the utterances of a single prophet makes it seem like nothing more than a competing set of doctrines that people can choose to have faith in or not. In reality, Darwin would be paralyzed with confusion by the modern biological sciences, having never even known that DNA exists or what molecules are in general. The amount of progress that has occurred since his time is barely conceivable. So to chop the head and limbs off of science, they pretend that nothing has happened in evolutionary biology since origin of species. In reality, pretending that modern evolutionary biology can be adequately described by origin of species is like pretending that quantum physics can be described by Newton's Principia. It's preposterous. Finally, they will often use the word materialism as a dirty word for describing the secularity of real science. Creationists believe in souls because they're afraid to die. Science does not support the notion of souls because there is no evidence for them existing. This is one of the key incompatibilities that allow creationist propagandists to elicit an emotional response from their targets. It's as if to say, science says you die, while we say you live forever. Who are you going to choose? It's highly manipulative. This wordplay is used generally by all creationists, but let's point out some of the trickery of intelligent design proponents in particular. First and foremost, they desperately seek to differentiate themselves from creationists, and young Earth creationists in particular. Part of this is because they want to appear scholarly, so they promote a brand of creationism that accepts a greater proportion of the body of scientific knowledge. But the main reason is a political one. These groups are funded by wealthy fundamentalist Christian donors with the ultimate goal of pushing America, and perhaps other countries, towards a system of theocracy. An early step they've been pushing for decades is to get religion taught in public school science classes. This used to be called creation science. Don't be fooled, it's creationism, just with the word science in there. However, in 1987, the Edwards v. Aguillard Supreme Court decision ruled that creation science is a religious concept and therefore a violation of the Establishment Clause if taught in public school science classes. This ruling was a problem for them, as they had been pushing a particular propagandized textbook that had creation science all over it. With this term now a dead end, they needed a rebranding campaign, hence intelligent design. This would retain all of the lies and distortions of creation science, all the same talking points. Everything would be the same word for word, except for two key adjustments. First, they would simply omit any specific mention of the Christian God, knowing that the credulous would fill in the blanks themselves. Here is how the original textbook defined creation science. Creation means that the various forms of life began abruptly through the agency of an intelligent creator with their distinctive features already intact: fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings, etc. The new book contained the new term and this definition. Intelligent design means that various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency, with their distinctive features already intact: fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings, etc. Shockingly similar, don't you think? But who could this intelligent agency be, I wonder? The second adjustment would be that they would replace every instance of creation scientists with design proponents. And by that, I mean they literally used a text editing search and replace tool. We know for sure this is what they did because the first post-Edwards version contained in one place the telling typo, "See design proponentsists," where the word creationists was improperly replaced by design proponents. How much more transparent can it get that intelligent design is just creationism with a different name, literally cut and pasted in its place? So when propaganda peddling intelligent design proponents tell you that they aren't creationists, tell them that, they are see design proponentsists. See how they react. Apart from this transparent treachery, there is so much dishonesty in the way these ideas are presented. Intelligent design desperately masquerades as science by accepting geologic time and some degree of common descent, but it simply is not science. It's just a glorified God of the Gaps argument. That's why it spends all of its time criticizing evolutionary principles rather than presenting original ideas, because it is trying to wedge open some artificial gaps for a god to fit into. This is not how science works. Intelligent design has no ability whatsoever to discredit evolutionary biology, but even if it could, that would not substantiate intelligent design in the slightest. It's never your theory is wrong so mine is right. Each theory must stand on its own merit, not that intelligent design qualifies as a theory in the first place. A new model must have at least as much explanatory power as what it attempts to replace. There is no paradigm shift where good science is rejected and replaced with absolutely nothing. New science must have more explanatory power, more predictive power, account for more observations, require fewer assumptions, and provide a program for further research. Intelligent design does absolutely none of these things. It's just preachers lying about science in front of stock images of laboratories to seem like they know what they're talking about. Because they have no ability to discredit evolution, they have to use arguments from authority in the way of misleading quotations from figures who are actually respected. For example, Karl Popper, a preeminent philosopher of science, said in 1976, Darwinism is not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program. Creationists have quoted this statement ever since, without noting that Popper, after improving his understanding of the biological literature, changed his interpretation to add the following: "I have changed my mind about the testability and logical status of the theory of natural selection, and I am glad to have an opportunity to make a recantation." Popper was a highly influential philosopher of science, but he was not a biologist, so he never had any authority in the field of biology. He should not be presented as though his words can refute an entire field of science. But particularly devious is the omission of his revised stance after he became more knowledgeable on the topic. Why do they resort to misrepresenting Karl Popper or other figures like Stephen Jay Gould? It's simple. There is not a single creationist or intelligent design proponent who is a respected member of any scientific or academic circle. This is a problem for them, since they need to try and paint the picture that there is serious discussion going on within academia surrounding these ideas. Teach the controversy. In reality, among actual experts, there is no controversy. Creationism is not science. It is exclusively preachers and propaganda peddlers working at nefarious think tanks denying basic evolutionary biology. Actual biologists, even devout ones, are not like this. The handful of figures they try to point to that are involved in academia that support creationism are always speaking outside of their field and either paid to lie or admit that they are specifically placing blind faith in biblical scripture above empirical evidence. There is no scientist that uses geological data to determine that the Earth is young. There are at best one or two who are credentialed, but admit that they ignore data in favor of their faith. So their scientific authority is compromised, and they should not be referenced as any more of an authority than a preacher or your neighbor. These sad examples of wasted intellect have fallen prey to Morton's demon, which lets some science into their brains and blocks the rest, so they present themselves as highly science-minded, learning all about different kinds of minerals and other concepts, but then block out anything that can dethrone their faith-based worldview. And with the creationist preachers themselves, these are barely real people. They exist as the personification of the confirmation bias of their flocks. They have a script that has been debunked 1,000 times, which they keep repeating over and over again anyway, because their targets ignore the refutations and don't understand them in the first place. When given an opportunity to expose such a figure, rebuttals must be made as intelligible as humanly possible to maximize the chances of getting through to somebody. Dogs always produce dogs seems intuitive and technically isn't even wrong. It must be explained to people how this statement does not contradict evolution. Each creationist talking point must be hammered down to a nub from all directions. They must not be allowed to gish gallop. They must be backed into a corner and brought to submission. When all other options are exhausted, preachers will use their Hail Mary play. With no ability to substantiate their script, they will simply exclaim that evolution is like a religion because it's not testable or repeatable. Once again, this is ridiculous. We already discussed the types of observations and predictions that evolution can make, but creationists are specifically complaining about the fact that we did not watch the entire history of life on Earth with 3D glasses and popcorn. Of course we didn't. It doesn't matter. In science, we don't need to watch or even be able to see things in order to learn about them. We can't see atoms, yet we do chemistry. We can only see a tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, yet every portion has some practical application. We did not watch billions of years of evolution, but we can make reliable inferences based on the data available to us, which we have discussed throughout this series. Imagine a crime scene. Does a detective say, "Aw, shucks, I missed it. I guess I'll go home"? No, they begin to gather clues, fingerprints, blood samples, and so forth. These clues will help elucidate what happened and hopefully identify a culprit. This is an empirical approach to solving a case, just like a scientist would behave with their particular research question. "You weren't there" is not an argument against science ever. With no actual argument to make, this is why creationists and intelligent design proponents are forced to lie about the evidence supporting evolution. It is undeniably consistent beyond reasonable doubt, so they have to erase it in order to ensnare their targets. They lie about the duration and nature of the Cambrian explosion. They lie about the lack of transitional fossils. They lie about high school level genetics concepts. Dishonesty is their only recourse because the evidence is overwhelming. Nevertheless, cognitive biases keep creationists in this mental space. They will display an unreasonable level of skepticism towards the scientific process and the entire body of scientific knowledge, while displaying absolute blind credulity towards Scripture. If a creationist starts saying you weren't there or playing the how do you know game, you can turn it back on them and their Scripture on a dime. Press harder than they press and see how quickly they become desperate to change the subject. How do you know is the most important question in science, while it is absolutely forbidden in religion. The reason it is forbidden is that what creationists actually fundamentally believe is completely incompatible with logic. It is actually breathtaking how ridiculous it all is when you really stop and think about it. If they are young Earth creationists, they believe in a God who made millions of different types of organisms just to wipe almost all of them out, including almost all humans. Why? Do omniscient, omnipotent deities make mistakes? If they believe in common descent with divine intervention, they believe in a deity that has to keep tinkering over time because he can't figure it out on the first try. A powerful deity would be able to design a universe with the right conditions for life to arise and just let the whole thing play out. Instead, the creationist god is sitting in the ocean putting together a trilobite because he's dissatisfied with what has showed up thus far. Is this really the all-powerful deity that should elicit fear and obedience from us? Then there are those who think the fossil record is a trick from the devil or a test from God to see if we will reject our own logical faculties in favor of blind faith in a God that makes no attempt to substantiate his own existence. And those of us who do not submit with so little reason, we are punished eternally for being as smart as he made us on purpose? It all falls apart so quickly. If he doesn't know what we're going to do, he's not omniscient. If he knows what we will do but isn't in control of it, he's not omnipotent. If he knows what we will do and made us to do those things, only to torture us eternally for what we did not even decide for ourselves to do, he's not all-loving. At the very least, we can reject the God of the Abrahamic religions on this basis alone. It doesn't mean no God exists, but we can start ruling out some popular versions pretty easily. But that is why creationists are so insistent on the idea that science and logic must be reinterpreted to fit Scripture, never that Scripture should be reinterpreted to fit science and logic. The Scripture is the ultimate authority, and asserting it over reason is the only way to retain any power over someone's thought process. The moment critical thinking creeps in, it has to be shut down. People must be told that everyone is engaging in blind faith, not just them, and they chose the right thing to put their faith in. The ancient words of ignorant men are more reliable than what we can personally and empirically ascertain to be true in this modern era, and anyone who tells you otherwise is the devil. This is the attitude that can make it so challenging to debate creationists, whether they are genuinely misled and defending their faith, or they are bad faith actors projecting certainty in order to ensnare more followers. Their confidence, their fake knowledge, you must poke a hole in it. You have to identify their weak point and press on it. Every time they change topics, bring them back. What do you mean the probability of a protein forming by chance is such and such number? How did you calculate that? Based on what parameters? They know very well they can't answer. They are just regurgitating a talking point that sounds convincing to the uneducated at face value. So when they inevitably gish gallop, cut it off. Loudly point out that they're obfuscating. Redirect to your line of inquiry. Why can't you answer this question? Any creationist who makes it a point to debate regularly is undoubtedly dishonest and deserves this merciless treatment. Only by showing how clueless they are about the entire body of scientific knowledge can one expose their lack of authority and disempower their rhetoric, which will always turn to morality. They need high stakes, so they pretend evolution is tied to moral bankruptcy, linked to Nazis, eugenics, and so forth. This is all a script of lies. Altruism is the product of evolution. Nazism was a Christian movement. As philosopher of biology Robert J. Richards pointed out, leading Nazi theorists specifically rejected Darwinian evolution because of its materialistic character. Whatever they bring up in this arena, it's total bullshit. Some people do bad things, and many of those people are religious. The end. The most egregious misrepresentation is the notion that morality is impossible without a deity. But we exist with morality, and there is no evidence for a deity, so clearly no deity is needed for morality to exist. Morality may not be objective, as we quickly realize with people having different notions of what is moral, but atheists are at least as moral as religious people, and it does not contradict evolutionary principles whatsoever. Take a look at bees and ants. Animal behavior is complex. Survival of the fittest doesn't mean kill everyone around you. Sometimes it means form cooperative networks and take care of one another. Whatever maximizes the probability of survival and reproduction, and consequently, whatever causes certain genomes to perpetuate. That's all there is to it. But in general, creationists will always spew this script about morality to raise the stakes, and they will always put forth a ridiculous persecution complex. Everyone is trying to stifle the poor Christians. They've been marginalized all along, especially among the nasty, godless scientists who are threatened by their purity and faith. They can't handle our truth, and they're trying to keep God out of the curriculum. In reality, it's creationists who are allergic to truth, and putting religion in public school science curricula is specifically unconstitutional. Scientists can be religious, and many are, but religion is not science. Creationists are not part of science. They don't learn science. They don't do science. And real scientists don't waste a single second thinking about them. They're too busy doing science. Nevertheless, some creationists really do believe they are in a spiritual battle to convert everyone, to save them all from hellfire. To them, this justifies their desire to infringe on the Constitution, to infringe on individual rights. They really think it's the ultimate truth. And they have the right to believe these things in the privacy of their home or church. But when they try to wield political power to inflict these beliefs on others, they've crossed the line. Politely or not, they must be stopped because it's a slippery slope. In summary, creationism, by any name, even intelligent design, is nothing but superstition and a tool of oppression. Humanity will be better off once we can help everyone leave it behind. This is not just in the interest of rational thought, but in the safety of society. Blind faith is a form of subservience, and those who grow accustomed to subservience will accept authoritarian rule. When of a religious flavor, authoritarianism is called theocracy, and we are already seeing the first signs of this in America. The rollback of human rights on the basis of religious reasoning, the attempt at shoving religion into public school science classes, these are the first steps. I've outlined this danger in other content, so I won't get too deep with it here, but it is a genuine battle that is being fought, and disillusioning as many of their captive minds as possible is a directive of critical importance. A key aspect of this fight is the promotion of general science literacy. That's why I continue to make academic tutorials in as many subjects as possible, to offer a resource people can use to gather the general knowledge that renders them immune to these influences. But I also have created other content dismantling the specific propaganda that is disseminated by organizations like Discovery Institute. All of this content is linked in the description, so if you found this series useful and informative, consider continuing your learning with some of these other resources. Whether you seek to debate some creationists or simply convert a few family members over to the side of reason, I'll be rooting for you.